I remember the day my sister took a picture from Tanzania, walking behind lions. And I said, baby, did you hold a meeting with the family witches in your hometown before doing this one? Because for all we know, the story of Daniel happened once. Are you challenging the Bible? And so what I'm saying is, in this day and age, a lot of things are shifting. So that if you don't take care, you will think the Bible stories are folk tales. In the midst of all the developments, the selfie taking with lions and everything, we should still make room to find the manifestation of God. Somebody said in Ghana, when you buy a car, it is a breakthrough. But elsewhere, you take a credit card and you buy a car, and it is not a big deal. So it is not a testimony. But for us, it is a testimony. So in every situation, there is the hand of God. And we have a responsibility to discover it all the time so that we can continue to stay faithful and grateful. We will now go into the first session without wasting any more time. We're going to experience a lecture. The lecturer giver this morning is an astute intellectual, a professor who specializes in critiquing. She is a keen eye when it comes to critiquing theater, a researcher. I am trying to summarize a lot of things so that we can save time. This professor has served in many, many capacities. In fact, she has served for the second time as the head of the School of Performing Arts. She has been an executive member of the International Federation for Theatre Research, IFTR. She has been an ACLS, and she has a lot of scholarly publications to her credit. Ladies and gentlemen, with a round of applause, please, let us welcome a professor whose first degree, second degree, came from the University of Ghana. She had a PhD in Birmingham University. This professor came back to the university to give up of her knowledge this whole time, writing, publishing many scholarly works. With a round of applause, we welcome Professor Awomana Asiedu.
And I thank the Lord for the opportunity to share a few thoughts this morning from the perspective of African literature. I think yesterday our focus was mainly on the perspective from the theological side. I nearly backed out of this task, but these are thoughts that have lived with me since the beginning of my career. Can I have more light, please? Thank you. Since the beginning of my career. But as I was telling some friends this morning, having these thoughts in your mind and putting them together as an academic paper are not the same. And it's taking some time. So please accept this as a first draft, work in progress. I would like to start my presentation with a quote from a letter written by a 13-year-old, another teenager. God really uses young people. This is a letter written by a 13-year-old girl to Kofi Awono, the late renowned Ghanaian poet and Africanist, after he had given a talk in her school. And she wrote, and I quote, "They conclude that all things African are bad, and all things European and American are good. I know that the world will be a better place if all of us respect one another's way of life, agreeing that no one is either superior or inferior, and that all of us are equal, but our ways of seeing the world, worshiping God, rearing children, or tending our crops may be different." End quote. This letter by this teenager underscores two ideas that inform this presentation on African identity and Christianity in African literature. Well, I missed my title. Let me go back. This morning, my paper is titled African Identity and Christianity in African Literature. That is what I propose to speak on. Now, this letter underscores two basic ideas that inform my presentation. One, at the most basic level, the transatlantic slave trade and the colonial enterprise denigrated African people and cultures and perpetrated the notion of Western superiority and African inferiority. Two, Christianity, perceived as a Western religion by many African writers, has often been equated to Westernization, and Westernization capturing the whole essence of the engagement of Africa with the West. Now, early on in my career as a teacher of African drama, I was struck by the ways in which Christianity was presented in some African literature. It was clear that Christianity was often equated to Westernization and seen as in conflict with African traditions. It appeared that to be a good Christian, one necessarily had to be or appear to be Western or to adopt Western ways. Being truly Christian and African appeared as an antithesis. This, I surmise, is because of the concurrence of the slave trade and colonialism and the advent of missionary activities in Africa. Missionaries came to be associated with colonial agents and the denigration of African culture and traditions. Secondly, Christianity presented a foreign god, in quotation, who was incompatible with African traditional religion. So African writers, like all writers, have been concerned with issues which affect their societies and reflect their times. And they have, from the start, been concerned with several issues. I just want to list four main areas. The first writers were concerned with redefining the African personality and culture. And I'll go a bit more into that. The second, the effects of the slave trade and colonization on African culture and personality. The third, neocolonialism and the political situation post-political independence. And the fourth is a potpourri of other social issues. In this presentation, I wish to focus on the first two concerns, showing how African writers have tried to redefine African culture and personality and the effects of colonization on that culture and personality, and the ways in which Christianity has been perceived in this process. I will draw on examples from literature, focusing mainly on dramatic literature. And so redefining African culture and personality. Prior to the advent of the African writer, the image the world had of the continent and its people was what European writers had given it. An image often concocted to suit and justify their colonial purposes. Even in cases where the writers were outraged by the unjust treatment of African people by other Europeans, they inadvertently perpetuated certain negative images of Africa. An example is in Joseph Conrad's A Heart of Darkness, published in 1898. Now, this novel was challenging European activities on the continent. But even in the title of the play, many have argued, A Heart of Darkness, there's a certain indication of Africa as a dark continent. So when African writers appeared on the scene in the early 20th century, therefore, they had the task of correcting these distorted images. The late Chinua Achebe, one of Nigeria's earliest and very well-known writers, stated that he was inspired to become a writer by some European writers such as Joyce Carey, in whose Africans he could not recognize himself. He felt Carey's Mr. Johnson painted, quote, a superficial picture of not only the country, but even the Nigerian character, end quote. Achebe sets forth very successfully to present an insider's view of his people. His early novel, which I'm sure many of us are familiar with, Things Fall Apart, in the words of Jonathan Peters, quote, depicts the pre-colonial Igbo society as a paradigm of traditional Igbo societies, with all their alluring and endearing qualities, as well as their less appealing sides. Now, much earlier in 1911, one of the first writers of fiction in Africa, the Ghanaian Casely Hayford, had written the novel Ethiopia Unbound, Studies in Race Emancipation. In this novel, he looks at African culture from within and endorses its value, much like Achebe does later. Hayford makes constant references to Ghanaian traditional culture and employs indigenous names in this novel. He concerns himself with many issues, including the question of the black man's claim to greatness along that of the white man. These attempts at presenting Africa to the world were certainly not the same as later attempts of the negritude writers of the 1930s. Now, the negritude writers were mainly Francophone African writers and Caribbean poets such as Diop, Senghor, and Césaire. And negritude, defined, is a literary and artistic expression of the Black African experience. In the historical context, these negritude writers were seen as, quote, an ideological reaction against French colonialism and a defense of African culture. Therefore, these writers encouraged an escape from the colonial reality into a mystical Africa, which obviated any necessity of a realistic representation. They over-romanticized Africa and presented it as a land of good only. That, I contend, is also a distortion of sorts. But beyond these writers, many African writers have continued to write about their people in a very objective and balanced manner. And they have written about many issues, including the many variations of Christianity. Almost invariably, as I've noted earlier, Christianity is presented in these texts as in confrontation with traditional religion and values. Now, the second major concern of African writers, where I'll dwell a bit more, the effects of colonialism on African culture and personality or identity. The interaction between the colonialist and the African provides diverse themes for African writers, as the effects of colonization can be traced in all areas of life in African communities: social relationships, marriage and family life, ethnic taboos and prejudices, traditional religion and its conflicts with Christianity, etc. The colonialists, some contend, did not set out to superimpose their culture on African culture, but rather sought to replace it with their own. The literature abounds with the clashes, often violent, that these attempts produced because of fierce resistance. Again, Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart serves as an erudite example of this clash. Okonkwo, the main character in the novel, resists colonial domination with all his being, and in the end, having lost his son to the colonizers and unable to match their ruthless methods, takes his own life. This theme of the conflict between African and European traditions is pervasive in the works of African playwrights of the 60s through to the 80s. And some examples include Wole Soyinka's Death and the King's Horseman, Asiedu's The Dilemma of a Ghost, Francis Mbuga's Aminata and the Burning of Rags, and Olarotimi's Kurumi, published in 1971. This theme, as would be expected, takes various forms. In some instances, the perpetrators of European culture or change are not necessarily Europeans, but the converted African against his own people. In Rotimi's Kurumi, the reverend man, a white missionary, is seen pleading with a die-hard traditionalist Kurumi to accept change. Here, Christianity, or reverend man, is presented as an agent of change. It must be noted here that the change which is in question in this play has no direct relationship to European culture or Christianity. Sufficient reason is provided in the play, however, to suggest that people advocating for this change have in fact accepted the ways of the Europeans / Christians and are thus influenced by them. The play is based on historical events of the Oyo Empire. The conflict in the play revolves around the traditional ruler's decision in 1858 that his eldest son succeeds him on his death, whilst tradition clearly stipulated that the eldest son of the Alafen or the ruler on the death of his father must commit suicide and be buried with him. And this is a similar context, a similar historical context upon which Wole Soyinka's Death and the King's Horseman is based. Now, all the rulers in the land agreed to this change, except Kurunmi, the eponymous hero, and he declares, and I quote, "We have tradition, and tradition is tradition. Time may pass, but the laws of our fathers, tested and hallowed by the ways of men, live on. That is tradition." And at this point, I want to read from the play an excerpt of what, in Kurunmi's mind, consists of tradition, what he means by tradition. and it underscores why he thinks holding on to tradition is so important. The Gabon viper. When the Gabon viper dies, its children take up its habits, poison and all. The plantain dies, its saplings take its place, broad leaves and all. The fire dies, its ashes bear its memory with a shroud of white fluff. That is the meaning of tradition. My people, we have tradition. This is what makes us men. This is what makes us people distinct from mud. Why? The pride of bees is in the honeycomb. The pride of the weaver bird shows in the skillful design of its nest. And where stands the pride of the monkey? Is it not in his knowledge of the secrets on treetops? The pride of man, my people, is in his tradition. The day the Iroko tree loses its roots is the day the baby ant shits on its head. The day a people lose their tradition is the day their death begins. Weeds they become. Floating, they know not where to, doomed. So this clearly reflects Kurunmi's very strong belief that to give up one's tradition is to lose one's identity as a people. Kurunmi is willing to stand by his decision even to the point of death. Kurunmi, like Okonkwo in Things Fall Apart, cannot bear change and chooses death instead. Christianity, which came along with colonialism because of European missionary activities, as I've said earlier, is equated to Western culture in African literature. Christianity, by its very precepts, bars the worship of idols and other gods, and was thus bound to conflict with African traditional religion. There are, however, varying attitudes towards Christianity in African literature. Some see it as positive and as having contributed to the development of African societies. Of course, we can see the many church schools and hospitals, etc. Others, however, scorn it and blame many problems of Africa on its introduction. In the confrontation between the Reverend Man and Kurunmi referred to earlier, the absurdity of giving away one's religion and culture for another is clearly presented in Kurunmi's words, and I want to quote him once more. Imagine me for a moment. I go to your country and tell your father, Mr. So-and-so, from this day on, I want you to give up the ways of your fathers. Cast away your manner of worship. Neglect your rituals. Mr. So-and-so, snub the shrines of your fathers. Betray your gods. Now, Reverend Man, how do you think your father would feel? For Kurunmi, therefore, to accept Christianity would be to abandon his tradition and thereby lose his identity. And in this play, the Reverend Man is left speechless and unable to respond to Kurunmi's challenge. In the Kenyan Francis Mbuga's Aminata, however, Christianity is seen to have brought the emancipation of women and other positive social changes. For example, tradition had barred women from eating chicken soup and owning land. But the radical Reverend Ngoya noticed that he is a convert, Reverend Ngoya, a Kenyan, using his own daughter, Aminata, demonstrates to his community that God made man and woman equal. If eating chicken is good for men, then it's good for women. After all, it's the women who cook the chicken anyway. Ngoya, however, oversteps himself when he wills his land to his only daughter. In that context, it was against tradition and culture for women to own land. And therefore, his oldest son, Ababio, cannot accept this and sadly takes his own life the day the land was to be handed to his sister. In both Rotimi and Imbuga's plays, the advocates of change or Christianity seem to triumph, but at very high costs, the loss of human lives. Both writers seem to suggest that change may be inevitable, but it is also very costly. And let me just say here that this play, Aminata, by Francis Imbuga, was actually commissioned by a church to help address this issue of female, and so in a certain sense, he was directed in the way in which this should be presented. This cost, it appears, could also be the loss of one's African identity, and that is where I am particularly concerned. Kobna Sechi, the first Ghanaian playwright, in his play The Blinkhards, lampoons Anglo-fanties who had bought into the lie of the inferiority of African culture and borrowed blindly from Western culture. He presents a situation where a person agrees to marry two people without the blessing of their families. Indeed, a couple in this play decide to get married the Christian way or the Western way without performing the traditional customs required for marriage. But the grandmother of the bride will have none of it. And so she goes and takes her daughter away from her Christian husband and gives her to another man who is willing to perform the traditional rites for her to be married in a proper way. Now, the crux of this play is that the man, together with the person, the priest in the community, take this grandmother and the woman to court. And as Sechi will have it, the court rules against the Christian or the progressive, in quotation mark, forces, and insists that her marriage with the man who had performed the traditional rites was the valid one. Now, the person, the representative of Christianity in this play, is outraged that a marriage contracted in church could be overturned in favor of a traditional marriage. This play brings to the fore the tendency of early Christians to adopt Western practices in the name of Christianity. Other examples include the adoption of English names, for example, as Christian names. I never had an English name, and people often ask me, what is your Christian name? Because my traditional given names could not be Christian. In a sense, therefore, it appears one must give up one's traditions, even those without any direct links to religion, to be truly Christian. Unfortunately, even today, there are notions of the white European wedding being the Christian way of marrying. Some churches even insist that their members have church weddings to validate their traditional marriage rites and make them Christian. I have witnessed couples married for years In one instance, the man was being considered for a position in the church, and the condition was that he had to take his 30 plus years of marriage to his wife to church to have a blessing before he could hold a position in the church, because his traditional marriage somehow was not Christian. A similar situation is presented in Ngugi wa Thiong'o's I Will Marry When I Want, where an old couple married in the traditional way are lured to borrow money to have a church wedding in order to Christianize their marriage and gain respectability. In the end, they lose their property and dignity and thus themselves. Now, some conclusions. Some African writers have suggested that there's no need to replace African traditions with European ones, though there's no wisdom in totally rejecting European culture either. The two, they suggest, can coexist, with a wise person selecting the good from both and rejecting the bad in both, for indeed, neither is perfect. This idea is evident in Wole Soyinka's The Lion and the Jewel, where Lakunle, the harbinger of change, is presented as a ludicrous schoolteacher who blindly applies European practices fruitlessly. Baroka, the traditional ruler, on the other hand, is presented as strong and wise in selecting which practices to adopt to the benefit of his people. Sidi, the village belle, who is sought after by both men, is caught in the middle. In the end, she chooses to go with Baroka, although he already has many wives. And Baroka sums up the situation thus, and I quote Soyinka: "The old must flow into the new," unquote. And here, Baroka subverts or reverts a Christian idea that new wine must be put in new wineskins. What would it mean for Christianity to coexist with African tradition? Is there room for such considerations? Or is dying to self, as the Bible encourages, a call to die to one's cultural identity? I would like to conclude this presentation by reflecting briefly on two lines from a poem by Kofi Awuno titled "We Have Found a New Land," which is quoted in the introduction to Kobna Sechi's play by Ayo Langley. Awuno writes, "Those who want to be seen in the best company have adjured the magic of being themselves." These two lines point to people seeking to be what they are not in order to fit in with others they perceive to be better than themselves. From our scripture engagements yesterday by our sister from Acts 17, we are reminded that God made, quote, "God made from every nation of men to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their habitation, that they should seek God in the hope they might find him. Yet he's not far from each one of us." Acts 17, 26 to 27. All nations, all cultures were made by God. From this verse, each has value in his sight. And there is magic in being oneself. To denigrate oneself and one's culture in favor of another is to give up the magic of being holy, what God intended for us to be. Christianity is not a Western religion, I believe. And I'm sure ACI would endorse this. It is a world religion, and so must have its manifestation in the multiplicities of cultures it inhabits. We, as African Christians, should be free to express our faith within that identity, for that is what God made us to be, African and Christian. Let me go back to where I started and read again the wisdom of this 13-year-old. For me, it summarizes what I'm trying to say. They conclude that all things African are bad, and all things European and American are good. I know that the world will be a better place if all of us respect one another's way of life, agreeing that no one is either superior or inferior, and that all of us are equal, but our ways of seeing the world, worshiping God, rearing children, or tending our crops may be different. Thank you very much.
A good round of applause for that. We had intense discussions on this topic yesterday. Our culture and Christianity. Here we have been presented with another side of the story. At this point, we welcome questions, contributions, suggestions, contradictions. Yeah. Do I see a hand?
Hello.
There you go. There's a hand at the back.
Modogo. Bokovi My name is Bokovi. I would like to ask that in relation to the Kenyan incidents, will you say that without that reverend priest, no indigenous knowledge would ever be enough to see that women need to eat chicken? That knowledge can only be found in Christianity or a reverend? Could it be that even up till now, if that reverend has not been there, there wouldn't be any African indigenous knowledge that would be reasonable enough to think that chicken can be eaten by women? That is my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, there is another hand. Yeah. Reverend Settles? Okay.
Thank you, Prof. My name is Akrofi. Yeah, my name is Akrofi. Just a contribution. So I met a friend and I told him that, oh, I now have a son. So we thank God Almighty. What is his name? I said his name is Delasis. And what is his Christian name? And then I said, what is the meaning of Delasi? Are you trying to say that Delasi I'm talking about in the hands of the devil or a lesser god. Because the Lassie means in the hands of the Savior or in the hands of the Lord. So that is his Christian name. And he said, well, I think you are going to give him like Daniel or, something like that. I said, my friend, I am an African and I am a Christian. So that is the Christian name. So it is really important that we also try to translate this onto the younger generation for them to understand. A lot of the other names especially, all of them are connected to God. Most of them, the Lassie, Selassie, Mauli, and the rest. And so it is important that we have to identify even our Christianity in our names. Yes, it is really important. Thank you very much.
Another hand. And then yes, please.
Thank you, Prof. Asiedu. If you look at Christianity from the point of view of colonialism, you see it to be something that works against our culture. Another scholar, a Christian scholar, Lamisani, he says that through Bible translation, Christians have been able to some extent to engage with African culture. And therefore, he urges us to continue to work on translation where we are able to make Christ to be more and more at home. So I just want to point out that through translation, opportunity for the church to engage with traditional culture is a process that continues with the gospel and culture engagement. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll take two more questions and then Prof will answer, will respond. After you, Prof, Dr. Settles, yeah.
Thank you very much, Prof. I've gained some knowledge in the appreciation of my culture at ACI. But probably let me just get your own perspective as somebody that is in the arts. So, because from the point, they conclude that everything African is evil and everything European or American is good. So what have you to say to us? Because for me, I see that they conclude not only the Europeans, even us Africans, we ourselves think that everything African is evil. For example, a man coming from his village, once he comes to the town, they will advise him, don't go back to the village because everything in the village is just evil. So what have you to say to someone or an African who is thinking in that perspective, that everything about our culture, everything about traditions are evil? Thank you very much.
Prof, Aiko, you have done well. I want to make a bit of a comment picking from where my brother left off and coming from the context of the United States. It's very interesting coming into the Ghanaian African context. Your experience of colonialism is quite different than the Black American and Caribbean American experience of enslavement and its consequences after. And what I find intriguing about your presentation is, as my brother was mentioning, this American, particularly American but European mindset that, have I done something wrong? That you should forget your tradition, forget your past. And in the context of America, it's a very strong mindset. The whole idea of America is you come there to become a new person. Whatever was your tradition, your culture, forget it. In the context of enslavement for Black Americans, it meant being entirely, as far as they could, to sever entirely any link with your African past, because that was to be totally denigrated and you were to become a totally new person. In fact, an enslaved person. That's a story for another day. What I find fascinating is the Black American resisted that notion continuously. Constant resistance against cultural obliteration. Then I come to Africa, and I find it fascinating that some of the very things that the Black American resisted, in other words, being defined and delimited by white categories, many Africans run to embrace. A small example, and then I'll sit down. I find it fascinating the way that in some homes, some Ghanaian parents are so interested in their children making, quote unquote, what they term progress in life, that they don't even want their child to learn their indigenous language. And the schools de-emphasize proper teaching of the language. I mean, my children are taking Twi in school. They cannot understand Twi, but they are passing classes in Twi, because the way it is taught has nothing to do with comprehension. It has to do with passing an exam. And then in the home, it is not reinforced. Meanwhile, the diasporan people are saying, even the language we have to speak by force is not the language of our forefathers. Why, my sister? Why are you Africans running away from what God has given you in the name of progress? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. Clearly, there are many issues that this paper didn't deal with. Time and other things. The first one about indigenous knowledge. As I said, if you heard me, this particular play was commissioned, I can't quite, was it by the World Council of Churches to celebrate Women's Day or something? So it had a mission. And so that was why it was focused there. I know that there are debates about women, the role of women in African tradition, that suggests that even the relegation of women to second-class citizens on the continent is European. But I don't buy that completely, because when you look at some of our own proverbs and songs and ideas, there's embedded in there a certain perception of women that is not necessarily liberating. And there are traditional provisions that encourage the male child as against the female child. There may be some ways in which indigenous knowledge could be liberating for women, but I haven't found any. Maybe you can enlighten me on that. But certainly this particular play was commissioned to project the need for the recognition of women as equal citizens and as being able to eat chicken soup. I thought that was rather interesting, that there was an issue about eating chicken. Yes, I agree with you. Names, as I said, I don't have any English name, and so I don't have a Christian name, but that's okay. I'm born again. Jesus is my savior. So my name is written in the Lamb's Book of Life. My awomana is written in the Lamb's Book of Life. That's what's important. Yeah. Thank you very much, Reverend Sulesa. I was leaving the theological reflections to the experts. So even though I did think about Kwame Bediako's work, that Christianity not being a Western religion, and obviously Lamisani, as you mentioned, also presenting ways in which Christianity has tried to engage with African culture, I couldn't go into those, but maybe in developing this, one has to bring that. And in my teaching, I do try to bring out how we need to decouple Christianity as a religion from Westernization. That Christianity and Westernization cannot be coupled because Christianity has a much bigger scope. I mean, it's clear in the Bible that Christ is for all nations. And so to box Christianity with Western ideology is faulty. So I do accept that, and we can't explore the ways in which Christianity has brought life to the African context. But what is reflected in the literature and what I'm saying is that coupling whereby people are required to be Western in order to be Christian. That is what I am hitting against. The brainwashing, the effects, the long-term effects of colonialism. Somebody says colonialism did not last for us for very long on the continent. If you look at it, it's just about 100 years. But the colonial impact is deep. Our psyche as Africans has been damaged in a very deep way. And it will take the transforming power of God to actually liberate us. I often have, I say, by having lived outside this country as a young teenager, I was cured of the fascination with the West. But I've had classmates who have been in a hurry to abandon Ghana, to abandon the continent because of the difficulties we have here, thinking that what is out there is better. Just recently, I was talking with a friend and she said the first time she went to London and she rode the underground, she was shocked because she saw white people as homeless, begging for money from her. And her imagination always had been that the West is heaven. And it's all that imagination, all that equating of all that is bright and beautiful is out there, and all that is dark and ugly is here. And we need to find a way of liberating ourselves from that mental slavery. A song comes to mind. You know, and so it is a long-term project, and I, in my teaching, in my classes, if any of my students are here, they will testify, I'm all constantly pushing for us as Africans to rethink who we are in Christ. And it is sad to find it in church. You know, this negativity about us as Africans. One of the very sad aftermaths, I think, of colonial domination is as a hatred of self. You know, if you read Fanon and other thinkers on the effects of colonial rule, is a certain hatred of self, because you have been made to believe that you are less than others. So that constant hatred of self and that constant desire to become what you are not in order to be. You know, see how we valorize lighter-skinned people. Why is that? I think one of the most evil outcomes of colonial rule, of white domination, is the desire of people to bleach their skins, to look whiter. And for me, that is something that we need to address as individuals. And I could go on and on and on about this. This is a pet subject. You know, but then God made us who we are to be where we are for His glory. He's able to, I can be a proud African Christian and live my life as an African glorifying God. I don't have to be, I suppose you get what I mean.
Okay.
Other experiences, the African American experience, Joshua, it's a sad situation. And I guess it's the same thing that I've been trying to address. And I think that it will take work. The language issue is a big one. And sometimes we fall into it without even thinking, because I'm guilty. And there are various reasons. It's not because I think English is superior that I speak English with my children. It's the practicality of it. I speak Ewe, my husband speaks Akan, but that's no excuse really. But it's happened, and I regret it every time. But then I encourage my children to learn, to still learn. You know, and it's funny because my late dad insisted that we spoke only Ewe at home. Even when we lived in the US, he would say that language is for when you go out there. At home, you speak Ewe. And it was a struggle for me to speak English with my father when he came to visit because my husband does not speak Ewe. You know, so it's a complex thing. And small, we'll get there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We can take a couple more questions, suggestions whilst we are waiting for the hands to shoot up. I will share another experience. There's a hand. I go to a charismatic church. I go to the English service. And then one day, an announcement is made that there's going to be an event. We're going to receive some very important persons. And so people should come dressed sharp, look sharp. Don't come here wearing some African shirt or African print. You see, if he hadn't even added, don't come here wearing some African thing, I would have taken it. But because he said it like that, I got too infuriated. I began to question too many things that even the English they speak it as if to impress. So it comes to question whether we are worshiping God in truth and in spirit, or we are pretending to look posh. Are we entertaining? And so I left the English service and I joined the Ewe service. We danced Bobobo for praises. We danced Agbaja and everything, and I felt très bien in this space. What happened? Only a couple of weeks ago, a meeting was called of all deacons and elders. What is the issue? The head deaconess says to come to the communion table, every male must wear a suit and tie, and every female was generous. If you don't have a skirt suit with a fascinator, then you know that thing they wear. Is it called fascinator? I don't know what it is. You wear that, or you come wearing your kaba nicely like Prof and wear full shoes. Oh my goodness. Did I go or did I come? This is now in the Ewe service. I am colonized. Dede, you have the floor. And then there is a hand here.
QAMO. Thank you very much. Mine has to do with. My question is, who are we? And my submission is geared towards the recent confusion we had with the guns and some people in Ghana. Recently we had a young girl being called. They said the gods have called her. People are saying she's too young to get married. That one is a different issue. I don't have any problem with that one. But my problem is, why would you say, why has the gods called her at such a younger age? When David was called, were we there? Do we know his age? You go to someone, so obey your soul. That one you are happy about it. But the gods have called someone, and you are questioning that. So who are we? What do we stand to gain when we relegate whatever we have as Ghanaians to the background and then worship what the Western people have put in place for us? Someone say, when I grow up, I want to become a father or a pope or what. That one, you're okay with that one. But the gods have called someone. It's not like the person is going to cut off people's heads. The person is just going to be a mediator between the people and the God. So what is the problem? Who are we? Thank you.
The next person is Dr. Terry Bright, and you've had a round, yes. Both of you've had a round. We are watching the time too.
Yeah, you said my name is Terry Bright, but for this particular situation, I'm Kweku Fosu.
Yo.
Okay, so I think the issue that I want to talk about is the issue of language. Here we are, full-blown Africans, black skin. I am holding a microphone, speaking someone else's language. I have seen it several on social media where a Ghanaian is trying to speak English. He or she is not speaking it correctly, and then they post it. And then we all have a laugh. You know, sometimes I can't control myself in my room. I'll be laughing so hard. The damaged psyche is one thing about ourselves. We do some of these things without even thinking about it, because the language thing has created this knowledge system that says that if you cannot communicate well in English, it means that you are someone who doesn't have wisdom, or you are not knowledgeable. And that is one thing that is creating that problem for us as a people. Speaking someone else's language, which is an official language, and there's nothing we can do about it. I don't know, maybe. I don't know. I go on television most of the time, and when I come out and I'm talking to people, I'm engaging people. Hey, Masa, uka brofo. Hey, brofo don't quite. What is brofo? For them, they think that is knowledge and wisdom. Okay? And so we as a people must begin to address that issue, because unconsciously it is influencing all of us. I don't care what you think. Every one of us, at least those in academia, as well as those who are not academics, because you listen to some of these reverend ministers who have not been with the English language, and some of their utterances tells you that, hey, where are we? Are we going or we are coming? Thank you very much.
Okay. So, well, because of our time, let's.
I want to say again. I want to say again that the language question is a complex one, and one that doesn't have simple answers. Terry, if this morning I came here and presented this talk in my mother tongue ever, you will not understand what I'm saying. I don't know how many people here would understand me. And so, very few. And let's be honest, I would not be able to engage in this discourse as efficiently in my mother tongue. I don't have the training for that. I'm not excusing it. What I'm saying is, we have to see English as a Ghanaian language, because that's what it is. Okay? That is what it is. Somebody asked, who are we? And yesterday there was talk about authenticity. We are a product of what's the word? We are a product of many cultures. We are a product of Western influence and African traditions. The contemporary 21st century African, we can't deny who we are as a result of our history. We are what our history has produced. What I am trying to say is that we should not valorize other cultures above our own. And as I said, Shoinka's play, we need to take what is good in our culture and take what is good in other cultures and keep it. English has served as a lingua franca. Without English, perhaps we cannot function as an institution adequately. We would need multiple translators and so on. What is important is for us not to denigrate our own languages. It's for us not to lose our languages, for us to find ways in which we can preserve and keep them alongside. But like it or not, English no longer belongs to Britain. There are various forms of Englishes now. And what we need to do is embrace that. We can't run away from it. So who are we? I am a born-again Christian. I will not allow some God to call my my child. It depends on I don't know, but that's a complex issue that we can't even address here. And I think that as Christians, if we say we are Christians, our mandate, as Jesus commanded us in Matthew 28, is to go and make disciples of all nations. We have a task to evangelize our cultures and our traditions. Why should a child lose, I don't know the context, forgive me, lose opportunity to go to school and live as an ordinary child because some deity has called for her? Is that a positive thing? Is that something we want to encourage in our 21st century Ghana? Many years ago, human sacrifice was acceptable within the African context. Now, I'm sure we will all frown on human sacrifice. Is that a traditional practice that we would have liked to encourage in the 21st century? I don't know. So there are bigger issues at work here, Dede, that I don't think we can address. So we need to be thinking, who are we as contemporary 21st century African Christians? And thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. A few announcements. We have brought the session to a close. Thank you, Professor Awo Mana Asiedu. And let's give her a round of applause. It's been a very interesting engagement. I think the way to go in the area of language is that language has moved beyond just vocabulary to the expression of thought. So even though we will use the English is and was, it should express our cultural thought patterns. You can read Song of Lawino, Song of Ocho. Ocho speaks English. Lawino speaks African English. When you read the two, you will understand. As soon as you read, you know that Lawino is an African woman, etc., etc.